This is gonna be a different video than usual, and why?
Because we're going to be doing a homage to my father, Joseph Benedict Major. I'm going to tell a few stories about him, and we're going to hear a few stories from friends, family, and colleagues.
Yes. I'm Christian.
I'm Eric.
We're the Fluffies. And now you go.
Last May 2019, my dad passed away in Montreal, Canada. And this past Friday, March 20th, would have been his first birthday not with us. He would have been 88 years old.
Which is interesting because his father and my mom, who's still alive, their birthday is very close. They're only less than 2 months apart. He was from March 20, my mom is from May 15, and he passed May 21st, right after her birthday.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. My father was Joseph Benedict Major, and my father was born March 20th, 1932 in Budapest, Hungary. He was the sixth child, the youngest of six. And in 1957, he and a couple of his school friends, they decided to leave Hungary, which was suffering from a revolution. And so they took a ship to Canada. They landed...
They escaped through Austria, and then from there they went to Netherlands. They didn't came from a ship through Hungary, because there's no ocean there.
No.
Just to make clear.
Right. So they arrived in Canada, in Halifax, and then they made their way to Montreal. In 1950, that was in 1957. And in 1960, my parents, they met, and they got married in 1960 here in Toronto, actually. And then I was adopted 10 years later in 1970. And so so one of the stories that I remember vividly is we went for a lot of walks on the weekends. So we lived in Westmount, which is a very hilly part. So we would go up to the mountain, we would go for walks. This is when we talk about our week and other stuff like that. Also, my father loved art. So often on a Saturday or a Sunday, we would go to the many galleries in downtown Montreal. On many of the walks, for example, when we lived downtown Montreal, we went for walks up to the mountain, and I remember that there was a staircase. I used to call it the magic steps, because at the bottom of the stairs, my father would ask me to close my eyes and say some magic word. And so I would close my eyes, of course, and my father would pick me up and carry me to the top of the stairs, which was probably, I'd say, about 65, 70 stairs. And so I would keep asking, like, can I open my eyes? Can I open my eyes? And he goes, no, not yet, not yet. So when we got to the top, I would open my eyes when he said it was okay. And I was shocked. How did we get up the magic steps, I would call it.
Wow. And
so we had a lot of fun times. We went on a lot of trips together. Also, many weekends, my father was a workaholic, so he would go into IBM on the weekends to finish projects and whatever. So often I would go with my father, and I would be playing on the photocopier, or I used to play on punch cards. So this was like long time ago, obviously. So my father was usually the one who would put me to bed, and he would always tell me stories about childhood in Hungary, or Hungarian folk stories. And a few of the funny ones I remember, for example, was when he was very young, he went to a farm and he was bit on his ass by a chicken. And this always made me laugh because being a city boy, we didn't see chickens very often. So I just found it really funny. Another story that I always remember is how my parents got married. So my father was working at Esso, and by the way,
in Toronto.
Here in Toronto. And by the way, don't tell a child that your father works in a Esso, because Esso is a gas station. So I didn't think that there was a head office. So I always thought that my father was a gas station attendant. So anyways, so my father, when they got married, he wasn't the event type of person. So the way he and my mother did was they went to the city hall, they got married, and then my father went back to work. And so he always told me this story that he got back to work, and one of his colleagues who he shared an office with asked him, "Oh, where were you? I was looking for you to see if you wanted to go for lunch." "Oh, I just went out." "Oh, where did you go?" "Oh, I went to City Hall, got married." And they looked at him and like, "You got married and you're here?" I'm like, "Go be with your wife." So I always thought that was a funny story. And also my father, he went on many trips for work, so I always loved hearing about the different places that he visited.
Including Brazil.
Yes. And so he went to Brazil. He also went to visit his brother in Australia a few times. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to go with him. And several times I accompanied him on vacations or business trips. I remember going to Germany with him and stopping by seeing his family in Hungary. So we had a lot of good times.
Yes, the last few years was when he met my mother. They met my mother. It was so cute. Every time my mom talked to her, she would ask about him, and your father always asking about my mom. And he always mentioned, what he want to know about... There's something he had to know about Brazil. I forgot what was it.
I don't remember.
Yes, we got a map for Brazil, then show him to explain some things.
Yeah.
Also, it was exaggerated. Remember when we went to Brazil the first time or the second? He called my cousin.
Where
was so
are you?
worried. Yeah, because she speaks English, so he called her. Said, "Oh, your father is desperate after you, so call him. Otherwise, call the army
They're
after
the
him."
Jewish parents. What can you say?
And he also divided his life before and after his wife passed. So till 2012 was one way. After 2012 became another situation.
Yeah.
So he was very sad, very depressed, and his health
Went down.
Down. And he surprisingly he lived way longer than we thought.
We thought
2 years maximum.
Yeah. Like 2 years after my mother died, he would go also.
He's made 7 years.
7 years.
It was very impressive. After all, he managed to be strong for so long. Yeah.
And ironically, he passed away on the same day as his sister, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, a funny coincidence.
Yeah.
Why? Tell the story.
So when my father passed away, we contacted my family in Hungary, and ironically, my cousin was visiting her grandmother's grave at that very moment. So it's ironic, I find.
Yes. And in August 2019, we had a memorial
To celebrate his life.
Actually, before that, in 2012, he made a very big memorial to your mother.
Yeah.
We call that was his Taj Mahal. He put 100 people in the apartment. It was a big apartment.
It was a big apartment, luckily, but it was quite long and.
Okay, we started talking for a while. People from our was tiring. It was so 100 people in the same apartment. It was too hot, but people had so much patience because they knew that for him was important to get it out. And so it was very interesting all the homage he did for her. And so
we thought it was fair to do something for him. So we chose a place that was close to where I grew up. It was only 5 blocks away. And we invited some family, some friends, some colleagues. So it was fun to see everyone, to hear stories.
And it's why when I've learned so many things about him, that ironically, right, after being so many times, I really got to know more through what the family members and relatives and colleagues talk about. This is what you're gonna show now.
Yeah.
I met Joe when I was 16 years old, and my husband was his best friend, and Joe Barton. The three boys were very best friends from school. And we became very good friends for a long time.
And I first met Joe when we came from Israel, my husband and I, and we had 2 of our 3 girls in 1975. Etta's mother, Yolineni, and her sister were instrumental in making it possible for us to come to Canada. And just like Joe's life, built an amazing life. I think Joe was a role model for me and for us when we arrived to see what's possible to do as immigrants, and have really traveled a long way. I'm a nurse by profession. I just finished a term to be the president of the International Council of Nurses.
In the early 1980s, I was a young systems engineer on the Air Canada account, and we're having problems with running some applications on their mainframe system. So my manager told me to go up to the Field Support Center and consult with Joe on planning for the upgrade to the mainframe system. Well, Joe had quite a reputation at the time. He was a very, very famous person in IBM at that time, and I went up to the 7th floor with a little bit of fear and trepidation and not quite knowing what to expect. I waited outside his office, and when he came the time to see me, he sat me down, and I said, Joe, I think I need your help planning an upgrade to the Air Canada mainframe. So he looked at me and he said, what makes you think they need an upgrade to the mainframe? Well, I said, they're having problems with the applications. And he asked me, what type of problems are they having? Well, the applications are running slow. And then he said, well, are they the online applications or the batch applications? Well, I think it's the batch applications. And what data have you gathered in order to tell you that you need a capacity upgrade as opposed to, say, an upgrade of the disk technology? And he went on and on like that, asking question after question, gently, guiding me through the process about thinking about the problem, gathering the data that was necessary, and doing the analysis to diagnose the problem correctly and to come up with the correct solution. He did this for so many of us for so many years in such a gentle, confident, and humane way. He taught us how to think, and he collaborated with us in just an incredibly positively impactful manner. So thank you, Joe, for all of the gifts you've given us, for all the things you've done for us, and for all of the lessons that you taught us to think about our problems and apply information and data to solve them.
In the early 80s, I'm thinking it was 1981, I was a manager in the Field Support Center in Montreal, and Joe was on the staff there. And occasionally I would get up my courage and go into his office and ask him a question on just about any technical matter. And always left better informed, with a perspective on the issue that I didn't have before, and sort of just scratching my head somewhat as to how I could ever possibly hope to keep up with his grasp of everything to do with computing, which was totally astonishing.
Down at the end of a long hallway, and I had the unbelievable good fortune to be given the office right across the hall from him. So every day I had a chance to talk to him, I had a chance to listen, to learn. It was unbelievable good fortune for me. Tom Weagley mentioned about answering questions, and he was always very good at answering questions. But there was one thing, you had to have a good question. If you didn't have a good question, he was not shy about telling you that it wasn't a good question. He was very, very precise in his language, and he loved language, and he didn't like it when you weren't precise. I remember standing in front of his office once, we were talking about something or other, I don't remember what. I made a statement, and he uncharacteristically misinterpreted it. I don't know what got into me, but I had the gall to say, "No, Joe, what I said was," and I repeated the statement. He looked surprised, looked at me, thought of it, smiled and said, "Quite right." From then on, I was in his good books. He would help me, I would ask questions, he would give me long answers, much longer than I think he gave other people, perhaps because I needed it. He would often walk across the the hall with printouts in hand. He would say something like, "This data is interesting." And then he would proceed to tell me what the data meant, and I learned so much from him about the analytics, what information you could draw from it. He was quite amazing. I left IBM a few years after that and went on to do some design work for other corporations as a consultant. And I did have one project that was enormous, and I was scared out of my mind. I spent some time with Joe on a regular basis. I'd buy him coffee, and he would help me, as Tom Wheatley said, lead me through logical questions and things. As so often happens, I lost touch with Joe over the years. And 7 years ago, when I saw Etta's obituary in the paper, I posted a comment, condolence, on the website. An hour later, Joe phoned me and asked me if I would read a passage at her memorial. As many of you probably remember that. It was a short story written by H.H. Hunter that Joe told to Etta on their first date. I'm not sure if it was the first date in Montreal or in Toronto. But he told the story with himself as the prime character. And it was a charming story, and Etta, I'm sure, was charmed by that. Over the years, the next 7 years, my wife Judy and I had a chance to visit him in his condo. She would bake him cookies. I would bring him his favorite Korean dumplings, and we continued on when he was in his residence. He would talk a lot about I was going to say, we discussed, we talked. He spoke, I listened, I learned, I loved it. He would tell me about things that had to do with art and literature, music, and history. He told me about what life was like in Hungary after the Second World War. Not everybody knows, many of you do. Hungary went through the worst period of hyperinflation after the war that any country has ever seen, even more so than Germany in the 1920s. He told me about how the pingo currency devalued over a septillion times. A septillion is 10 to the power of 24. It's 1 followed by 24 zeros. Prices change every day. Prices doubled, tripled. The average person had real difficulty understanding what was going on, but Joe, with his ability with mathematics and data, was able to spot patterns, identify and the projections of the changes in prices. He became a commodities trader. He bought and sold and traded cigarettes and pencils, and was able to use that to feed his family. He was 14 years old. Richard Manicom, that you heard earlier, I think had the best definition, the best description of Joe that I ever heard. He said Joe had the brain the size of a planet. And I think that was a really good description. I was unbelievably lucky to have him as a teacher, as a mentor, and as a friend. And as George said, I miss him. I know that he's finally with Etta, who he adored, and thank you, Joe.
In 1965, I was sent by IBM to attend a course at McGill University, and the professor of the course, a one-day course, was Joe Major. It was a course about a very specialized area of mathematics called operations research. I wasn't surprised to learn that Joe had a master's in mathematics and that he was at one time a professor in Hungary. That course, which opened my eyes not only to the subject at hand, but introduced me to an amazing human being, an amazing teacher, an amazing person. As a teacher, Joe was deliberate. He was very convincing in his arguments, and somehow he instilled in me enough knowledge to allow me to proceed and progress within IBM. For the next 30 years, I I had a wonderful relationship with Joe, both professional and personal. He was my mentor. He gave me the confidence that I lacked as a green farm boy who arrived at IBM never having seen or touched or heard of a computer. Joe had a way of explaining things to his peers, to his students, to his management, to the world. A unique way of describing something, of thinking it through. Truly, he was amazing, and I owe much of my limited success at IBM to him. Last year, I decided to write a book about my experiences at IBM, and there were certain key people whom I wanted to interview for my book. One of them was Joe, but I couldn't find Joe. I'd lost contact with him from the mid-1990s until last year, and thanks to a succession of people at IBM, including George Galambos, who just spoke to us, I was able to track down Eric. And Eric told me where his dad was. So one day last summer, I made the trek to the Sunrise residence, beautiful residence, to meet with Joe. I asked at the front desk, could I see Joe Major, please? And they said, he's right there. He was sitting at reception. I said, hello, Joe. He didn't respond. I said, hi, Joe, it's Winston. He didn't respond. The lady, the caretaker, said, maybe you'd like to go into the living room where you can chat privately. I said, sure, that would be nice. So I sat down beside Joe, explained again who I was. There was no real response. Eric had warned me that Joe wouldn't remember very much about the IBM days. So I was about to say goodbye and call it a day. And I asked Joe, I said, do you remember when you taught me all about operations research? His head lifted up, the glint returned in his eye, and he said, operations research. Yes, I'll tell you about that. And he went on to a half-hour recounting of how he got into that field. And humble as he was, he didn't give any credit to himself, but only to others. So that's my experience with Joe, a brilliant mind, a dear friend, and an amazing man. We love you, Joe.
Joe and my father and a third friend, Chiba, who passed away many years ago, were all close friends since they were kids in Hungary. I grew up listening to stories of their grand adventures, and these three men were larger than life to me. One of my favorite stories about Joe was about his escape from Hungary. Chiba, along with his mother and his wife Mary and my father, with a group of other people, hired guides to sneak them over the border at night into neighboring Austria in December of 1956, shortly after the Hungarian Revolution. But Joe stayed behind because he had a promising career in Hungary, but soon after he changed his mind. He sent a telegram to my father asking him where he was going to be on New Year's, and that's how they knew when he was going to cross. But of course he didn't have the appropriate paperwork, so he took a train to a border town called Sopron, and then, get this, he jumped off the train in the middle of winter without the appropriate footwear and ran beside the train as it crossed the border. And then when it was far enough across the border, he jumped back on to a moving train to complete his escape. The stories I heard about Joe and his friends helped shape my view of taking risks, hard work, and the value of enduring friendships. When they were refugees in Austria, they had a chance to go to different places, but they all stuck together. They ended up in a rat-infested apartment in Montreal, which Eric tells me he's going to show you a photo of today, and they all thought they were living like kings because it was so far ahead from where they had come in Hungary. They all settled in the same city, had families in the same city, and I remember driving with Joe and Etta and Eric in their red Peugeot when they would bring Eric to visit every summer at my parents' country house. Joe came to Canada with nothing, and he built an incredible life for himself, with a long career at IBM. I remember my father bragging about his genius friend who could multiply 4-digit numbers in his head faster than you could punch them into a calculator. He spoke 4 languages, Hungarian, English, Russian, and German. Even towards the end, when he was living at an assisted living facility, he continued to work translating old texts of Russian poetry. From where he started to where he came, Joe went farther than most people can even imagine these days. Escaping from a war-torn communist country, coming to a new place where he didn't speak the language, teaching himself English, building a career, and raising a son. That's a life well lived, and a life worth celebrating.
My first memories of Uncle Joe were actually as a wrestling partner. My brothers and I, and sometimes the cousins, would jump on him while he was sitting on the couch, with the goal of dragging him to the ground. Unlike other adults and other uncles, Uncle Joe would never let the kids win while playing around with them. And the end result of the wrestling match was usually bruised egos and bruised muscles on our side. But that would never stop us from trying again. Uncle Joe gave me my first real summer job at IBM during my last year of high school. He had me programming educational games with minimal knowledge and less coding skills. He would meet with me every couple of days, and somehow, with his advice, I managed to get what I thought was something accomplished. A couple of years later, he told me he had some of his programmers look at my code, and it was so unconventional and incomprehensible that they couldn't fix it or do anything with it. Despite his somewhat gruff exterior, Joe was an extremely generous and giving person. This was probably never demonstrated more than during the famous Montreal ice storm. At that time, the whole city was knocked out for at least a week with no power, impassable roads, and generalized chaos. Uncle Joe and Auntie Etta's home, being in Westmount with underground power lines, was the only place in the city that had fully functioning power. And his home became a de facto refugee homeless shelter for anyone who needed it, including our extended family. He did strictly ration water and utensils, saying we wouldn't know how long we needed to use them, but it was clear that he had everyone's best interest at heart. Joe was also a prodigious walker, before power walking for exercise was a thing. I would often ask him, "Uncle Joe, how are you going to get back to work?" And he would say, "Well, it's an easy stroll from here at the Jewish General to downtown. I'm just going to walk."
My first memories of Uncle Joe were visiting him and Auntie Etta and Eric and Mama, both at their apartment on Copenhagen Street, the apartment that Eric showed pictures of, and later on at their house in Westmount. And I learned a few things about him. He spoke Russian. His English was clear, but sometimes it was hard to understand what he was saying, especially if he was telling a joke. And he was a wrestler. And I wasn't sure in my head now if he was a wrestler because he told me he was a wrestler, or if because he was Russian, or if because it was the 1970s in Montreal. He was just a wrestler. But in my mind, he was a wrestler. And he loved to eat, especially Auntie Etta's home-cooked food. A few years later, things had changed. First of all, Joe was Hungarian. He wasn't Russian. And two, he wasn't a wrestler. He worked at IBM. But he still loved to eat, and I still couldn't really understand his jokes. I learned he had a particular intelligence. He was excellent at mathematics and computers, and he shared that knowledge with Andrew, my oldest brother, and helped him get his first job at IBM as a school as a student doing an internship. He was very generous that way. Throughout the years, I continued to visit Joe and Antietam and Eric and Ajmama when she was alive. And Joe always had stories. Some of them were true, but it was very difficult for me to tell which ones were and which ones weren't. About a month or two before he died, I had the chance to visit him a couple of times at the hospital. And on one of the visits, Joe was particularly talkative, and he was very clear. And what did he talk about? He talked about his love for Antietam, and he talked about his love for Eric. And he told me that together they meant the world to him. And maybe for the first time in my life, it was easy to understand what Joe was saying, and that what he was telling me was 100% true.
For those of you who know the family, you'll know that my father, Robert Hirsch, is and was devoted to his little sister Etta in the way he is to all of his family. And of course, that devotion passed on to Joe and to Eric, who he loves and loved very dearly. I guess I'd just like to say a couple of words about memory and the next generation before I introduce James. I was very lucky to be able to be with Etta on her last day on this earth. And she said just one thing to me, which was, please remember me to the kids. So I guess I'm very grateful to Eric and to Christian for setting up this ceremony in Joe's memory, because I don't think there's any better way for my children and all the children to remember Joe and Etta and to learn firsthand of these experiences of these two wonderful people. My dad has 11 grandchildren of his own, and he's been devoted to caring for Joe over the last, how many years since her mother was passed? 7? Over the last 7 years. Eric has asked James to read a poem. I think it's very appropriate. James shares with my father a huge heart, and he has memories of visiting Joe and Etta at their apartment and swimming there and eating dinners there. But what's really incredible, and I'm very proud of him, is even after Etta passed away, James was committed to visiting Joe at his residence, even if those visits didn't mean sharing any words, but just to sit in his presence. The poem that Eric has asked James to read is one which gave Joe a lot of comfort upon Etta's passing. Hopefully, James' reading of it will give Eric and all of you some comfort now at Joe's passing. It was written by Mary Elizabeth Fry in the year of Joe's birth, 1932, and it's called "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep." James?
Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there, I do not sleep. I am in 1,000 winds that blow. I am the softly falling snow. I am the gentle showers of rain. I am the fields of ripening grain. I am in the morning hush. I am in the graceful rush of beautiful birds in circling flight. I am the starshine of the night. I am in the flowers that bloom. I am in a quiet room. I am in the birds that sing. I am in each lovely thing. Do not stand at my grave and cry. I am not there, I cannot die.
The memorial was a beautiful way to remember his memory, and for me, it's like you said earlier, to get to know more about him.
Yeah, it was very interesting to hear these stories. Some of them I've never heard of, and to meet people who have came and went in our life.
Yeah, I just realized that a lot about life is what you leave behind, like how many memories and things, and so you could see that in the end, from his beginning, it was very tough. In Hungary, it was a very poor and difficult life, but he managed to turn that upside down and raise a child, have a be married and have very successful career, and he left many good memories and many things in people.
Yeah, and he also wrote a memoir, which we are going to work on and try to get published.
Yes. Yeah, I read a little bit. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
So you to understand some things from later, why
he was the way he was.
Describing how was Budapest at that time and a bit of the family. It was very interesting.
Yeah, especially the wartime stories were interesting. And so if you knew my father through work, family, whatever, if you'd like to share a memory, feel free to share it down below.